Al-Qaeda and ISIL and groups like it are desperate for legitimacy. They try to portray themselves as religious leaders, holy warriors in defense of Islam. That's how they recruit. That's how they try to radicalize young people.
President Obama this week once again avoiding direct comments about the threat of Islamic extremists. This happening against the backdrop of that three-day White House summit on violent extremism. Critics are outraged that at a time when brutal atrocities continue to dominate the ISIS agenda, the White House has yet to decisively act on confronting the jihadists. Joining us now, the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and the author of the Battle for the Soul of Islam, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Welcome, sir. Great to have you here on the show again.
It's great to be with you, Uma. Thanks for having me.
There is heated debate this week over the priorities of this administration as ISIS continues its murderous rampage across the Middle East. The Kurds and Jordanians have been pleading for more ammunition and basic military hardware to help them hold back the jihadists. And meanwhile, the president holds a summit looking at the underlying causes of terrorism and proclaims it's a lack of jobs. What did you make of his comments?
Well, you know, it just continues the same old failed policies. I mean, back in 2011, they released a strategy which basically is called countering violent extremism. And as somebody who's Muslim and wants to see our House of Islam begin to counter the ideologies, I want to see a conference on countering violent Islamism, because that's the root cause. You know, there were some nuggets where it appeared like he was starting to get it. He mentioned that this was a Muslim problem that needs some Muslim solutions, and yet it was a complete cognitive dissonance because he doesn't want, I don't know if it doesn't have the courage or if his advisors close to him are basically part of the Islamist lobby. I mean, Uma, the hall was filled with countries and ministers that are basically feeding the ideological problem but just want to do away with the violence. It's almost like having a conference on drug violence and inviting the meth distributors to help you.
In many ways, it was as though he was acting as a professor in a college classroom talking about the overall concerns and root causes of terrorism. But, you know, there was no hint at this summit that produced a clear, unified, and immediate global strategy to ultimately defeat the Islamic State, instead issuing the declaration to the Islamic world, "We are not at war with Islam." Have you been able to figure out why this president appears to be the reluctant warrior in this fight against ISIS?
Well, because he doesn't want to look at what time we are in history. I believe he just, in order to identify that strategy, we would have to take sides within the House of Islam. And somehow the advisors, which are apologists for Islamism, as long as we don't address Islam, then reformers don't have a seat at the table. So number one, his advisors are the problem, which are usually the Brotherhood legacy groups in America, and globally the Islamist republics of Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc. are telling him, oh no, don't confront Islamism because that'll offend us. Well, certainly it will, because the reform and the separation of mosque and state against all these Islamist movements that are the pool that the radicals swim in. If you want to defeat Islamo-patriotism, which is the real drug that pulls the radicals away from America, into Syria, into Iraq, into Libya, it is the Islamo-patriotism that we have to defeat, and we have to promote liberty. The president didn't talk about anything about what we want to promote.
Right now, we are seeing some of America's European allies putting forward a narrative that acknowledges a confrontation not with Islam but with jihadists, and some have proclaimed that the West is in a holy war right now against these terrorists. Do you agree with that notion?
Well, I don't think the West is with a holy war. I think there's a holy war within the House of Islam. And what the West has a particular need to address in this time of history is to promote those who believe in freedom and liberty within the House of Islam against the theocrats. The West has been through this in the generation of the American Revolution and the defeat of theocracy in our history. Islam is in the same point in history. And yes, there's a holy war within Islam. It's in the prisoners of conscience in Saudi Arabia and Iran and Syria and elsewhere. That's where we have to take sides. And right now, ISIS is simply a symptom of that. You can't defeat ISIS without also defeating Assad and defeating the autocrats of the Middle East that have been so much the root cause that the administration wants to blame on jobs and other irrelevant issues.
So what impact do you think this lack of a unified, coherent strategy is going to have on our allies in the Middle East who have to deal with the terrorist threat directly in their own backyard?
Well, this is the problem in making one summit to solve the entire problem. Short term, our allies will help us with common enemies like Jordan, Egypt, and others that see Al-Qaeda and the Brotherhood as a threat. long term, if you want to have a summit of reformers and people that believe in liberty, don't invite the autocrats that really, don't really believe in real reform for liberty, and have a consensus conference of reformers in the West that want to infuse the long-term strategy for the defeat of the political Islam. He started the conference, Ummah, by saying in the 20th century we defeated fascism and communism. I was waiting for him to say this century is a long-term strategy against Islamism. That's why we needed two different conferences. One is a short-term military coalition one. The other is a long-term strategy against Islamism, which only Western-minded Muslims would really be on board with.
Well, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, always great to have your insights. Thank you so much for joining us. It's going to be a long fight on this one, it seems, from the White House before it goes forward and has that two-pronged approach as you're suggesting.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Ummah.